Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to show you how the choice of words when telling history can largely impact how people view others and how people come to comprehend or understand history. Now, I'm going to use the example of the Laibon, who was a very important leader among the Maasai, and also the Orgoyot, who was also at times called the Laibon among the Kalenjins. These were very important figures within the architecture of the governance of these two nations or these two republics. Now, when you read a few of the documents that were written, especially regarding the people who held spiritual leadership in African republics, there is a way they are portrayed. I'm going to give you an example. I read Richard Maynard Sargent's book, Kenya Diary, 1902 to 1906. This is actually a diary of his that was published as a book in 1957. Now, Richard Maynard Sargent was a soldier, a British soldier who was sent to Kenya, and he stayed in Kenya for those years. And he is the person often, it is said, killed Koitalel Arap Samoei, who was the Orgoyot of the Nandi people. Now, in his diary, when he is describing who Orgoyot is Koitalel Arap Samoei, he doesn't call him Orgoyot, which is the Kalenjin name or the Kalenjin word for that position. He calls him the Laibon, and yeah, even the Kalenjins use that word, the Laibon or the Olaibon. Now, he says, he tries to explain, of course, in his diary who a Laibon is, and he says Laibon is the chief medicine man. Now, I need you to take that in and to remember that he describes him as the chief medicine man. And at the face value, it might not seem like it's a big deal how he chooses to describe him as the chief medicine man. And I don't want to say that he specifically thought about it carefully and decided that it was going to be the chief medicine man. I don't think he did it consciously. It's just how everything worked in that society. And that's the best way you could describe who a Laibon was or who the Orgoyot was to somebody who did not understand the architecture of the Nandi governance. Now, he described him like that, the chief medicine man. Now, we go look at another document, and this is the document that was written by one Dr. John Ludwig Krapf. Now, Dr. John Ludwig Krapf wrote several books about East Africa and the Horn of Africa. And there is a book he wrote that is called The Vocabulary of the Ngutuk, or the Language of the Wakwafi People, the Wakwafi Nation. Now, in that book, he does a very good job describing the organization of the Kwafi Republic. We can, if you like, we can think of it as the Republic of the Maasai. Now, when he's talking about the organization of that republic, of course, he has to mention the Laibon, because the Maasai also had that figure in the structure of their governance. And the way he describes him, while Richard Maynard Sargent described him as the chief medicine man, Ludwig Krapf describes him as the chief sorcerer. Now, think about that, the chief sorcerer. Of course, that has even more negative connotation to it than the chief medicine man. The chief medicine man is just kind of like lowering what that position was in that republic. But when you say the chief sorcerer, in fact, now Ludwig Krapf puts some negativity to it. He calls the Olaibon or the Laibon or the Olaibon the chief sorcerer. And now, after you've gotten that, I want you to understand one thing. The position of the Olaibon in the Nandi Republic and in the Maasai Republic is not a unique position to Africa. It's not a unique position when it comes to republics or even states in the world. This is the position that otherwise elsewhere it would have been described as this position of the high priest. Of course, the high priest is a very important figure in very many states, not only republics. Now, I remember I read a book by one Baruch Spinoza, Theological Political Treatise, and he wrote, or he describes different forms of government in his book. Now, it is from him that I got to take some moment to focus on what we can call the ancient state of Israel. And he describes its organization. And for most people, especially for people who are Christians, often there is less thinking of the Old Testament as mostly describing a state. Israel in that Old Testament is actually a state. And if you read that book carefully, you come to realize, especially from the book of Exodus, you come to see a state. If you come to focus on that concept of a state, you come to see the state of that those people, and you see how it was organized. And it was from Baruch Spinoza's books that I came to realize, oh, that was actually a state. It's a commonwealth, as he calls it. And they also had a high priest, and high priest played a very important role in the organization of the state. Now, of course, in that organization, the people, the Israelites, as they were called, or they are often described as in the Bible, they called the chief priest Kohen Gadol, and he was the head priest, like all the other priests fell under his leadership, and he provided the spiritual vision, or the spiritual advice to the state. So everybody expected him to give the state a direction when it came to the relationship between the state and God. Now, when you go to ancient Rome, they also had a high priest. Initially, when Rome was set up, the king also served as the high priest. But then when the kings were chased away around 500 BCE, a new office was created, and this is the office that came to be known as the office of the Pontifex Maximus. Now, he used to be called like the king for religious matters, because the ancient Romans figured that it was not appropriate for somebody who was not a king to preside over rituals and celebrations that had to do with honoring the gods. So they chose the high priest, the Pontifex Maximus, to play that role. So the Pontifex Maximus, of course, presided over all the rituals and spiritual matters of the state. He was a high priest. Now, let's come to not long ago Europe. If you go to the United Kingdom still has, technically, they still have a high priest. The high priest in the UK is called the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's basically a high priest. You might not think of it that way, but it's actually the high priest of the United Kingdom. And there are specific functions that the Archbishop of Canterbury does in the state. And in fact, it might be interesting to find out that there are bishops who sit in the House of the Lords in the UK. And that's a tradition from, we can say, hundreds or even thousands of years. So that's the UK. They still have the high priest. And I'm trying to show you that the concept of a high priest in a republic or in a monarchy or in a whatever state was not a unique thing to Africa. And so calling them the chief medicine man or the chief sorcerer it was not accurate. In fact, it was meant to portray them in some negative way or to diminish their position of exactly who they were, because the high priest of the Nandi, the high priest of the Maasai, the high priest of the ancient Romans, the high priest of the Israelites of ancient, the high priest of the British, and I'm coming to another one, the high priest of the continental Europe. Now, of course, today the continental Europe, as it is called, is mostly, we can say, not very religious. They've abandoned religion to a large extent, or they have made religion basically a private matter, which is okay. But for thousands of years, continental Europe also had what you can call the high priest. Now, the high priest of continental Europe was the Pope for thousands of years, actually, or at least over 1,000 years. All the kings in Europe looked up to the Pope as the spiritual leader, and the Pope was actually like the leader above the monarch in most kingdoms and empires in Europe. And now he was the high priest because he provided the spiritual guidance and the spiritual vision, and he oversaw over very critical rituals, including marrying of the kings and the queens. That was the Pope had to give that blessing for the marriage to be considered to be formal and to be considered to be proper. So the concept of a high priest is all over the place in history. So when you come to Africa, Africans also had that, the high priest. Same case to monarchies, not just republics. Of course, the ancient or the Abyssinian Empire had its own high priest. And of course, when you go to the sultanates in the Horn of Africa and to the east parts of Africa and even to the west side of Africa and the northern part of Africa, the sultanates is so clear, like the sultan or the imam was, of course, the high priest. So high priest is all over the place. But what I wanted to show you is that the choice of the words to describe the high priest in African republics is so interesting that the best that Richard Maynard Sagen could do when describing Koitalel Arap Samoei is to call him the chief medicine man. He could not recognize him for what he was, even though Richard Maynard Sagen came from Britain and he knew that Britain had its own high priest, and he could not see that idea. He could not connect it and be like, this is their high priest, and use the proper wording or the proper words that is their high priest, but he decides to call him the chief medicine man, which is accurate to some extent, but how it is used, like it was meant to lower what the Oruwayot was. And with Ludwig Kraft, instead of seeing that this is the high priest of the Kwavi people and describe him accordingly as the high priest, and in fact, it's even more interesting when you consider the context in which Ludwig Kraft is telling us who the Olaibon was. It is in the context of him telling us about the political structure of the Republic of the Massa. And there is one thing that Ludwig Kraft does that is not done by many other people who write histories about Africa. He actually describes the nation of the Kwafi as a republic. He does that in his document. He recognizes it as a republic, but then he goes ahead and he uses this word to describe the Olaibon as the chief sorcerer. So that's an example of how words or the choice of words can be used to portray history of some people in a certain way. Those are my random thoughts.